Okay, the purpose of this video is to get you to think a little bit about the character of Victor Frankenstein's creation, commonly known as Victor Frankenstein's monster or just plain Frankenstein. Most people, when they come to the text, are expecting that Frankenstein will be the monster. I actually got asked a question to that effect by Tom the other day. It's a fairly reasonable expectation because every Halloween people run around wearing masks with the very commonly recognised image of Frankenstein. But it isn't obviously Frankenstein himself, it's Frankenstein's monster. At the outset of the novel, the word monster doesn't yet really apply. It's much more accurate to call him Frankenstein's creation. You'll notice from some of the things that we've discussed in class that actually the monster is made out of normal human beings. In the first chapters of the book, Frankenstein's creation is more or less a blank slate. It's a fact that he's spontaneously born. It's wrong to label him as a monster. The most monstrous thing about him is that he has been created by a man and not by God. So you could say that there's something monstrous about his creation, but any guilt attached to that creation has to fall to Victor Frankenstein. The creature itself isn't really guilty of anything at that point. So it's very important that you recognise that from the outset, whatever the creature does is largely inspired by the actions of other people. The way the creature is treated is what makes it turn into something evil. Now, it's worth taking a moment to think about the way that Hollywood represented this character. Commonly, the image that you see is of it lumbering along, and when you look closely, that's because the actor is made to wear ridiculous platform shoes. Now, the reason for that is because they've rather literally interpreted the fact that Frankenstein's creation is 8 feet tall. So to make him 8 feet tall, they put him in platform shoes. Now, the audiences loved the sort of slowly lumbering creature because it was great for creating suspense in the movies. But the fact is, he's made out of human parts. And, okay, they're large human parts. It creates a larger than normal human being. But the idea that he's some kind of a lumbering zombie type creature is very much out of keeping with the way that he's represented by Mary Shelley. He's often represented wearing clothes that seem to be, if not rags, they're very crudely made. At least one of the movies that I've seen shows him wearing a sort of a sheepskin tunic. Very coarse, almost as though somebody's basically taken a sheepskin and just slit it up the middle and hung it over their shoulders. This is very much in keeping with the Gothic style. Gothic movies tend to represent things that are crudely made, thrown together out of a few sort of hastily nailed together pieces of timber and leather. It's very much what you'd expect in a Gothic setting. But you mustn't make the mistake of assuming that because he wears these rather ragged clothes that Frankenstein's creation is unsophisticated. The reason why he's not very articulate when he's first created is because he's just been created. He doesn't have the use of language. He has no vocabulary. It doesn't mean to say he's unintelligent. Most movies tend to present Frankenstein's monster as being like most monsters, like a werewolf or some sort of a wild animal, being completely unable to speak. Now, what you'll notice later on in the book is that he's able to speak very well once he learns. He doesn't really become a monster until he kills William. At that point, you begin to realise that his personality has been warped by the terrible things that have happened to him. He's been greeted by a father who doesn't have any love for him. There is no mother, there's just Victor. And he realises that he's totally alone in the world with no possibility for companionship or a mate. He's rejected by everyone that meets him, and he's thrown out into the cold. And so he becomes bitter and twisted, and one after another he begins to hunt down and kill Victor's family. At this stage you can begin to see that the Hollywood image represents his personality much more effectively. You begin to recognise that as a giant lumbering monster, he sort of fits with the events in the novel. He seems much more likely to have been capable of murdering a child. But the bolts through the neck are a definite no-no. And when you really think about it, I don't imagine for a moment that Mary Shelley envisioned anything like that. It's too crude and too simplistic. But it is a lovely trademark, and people love to sort of recreate that. It's absurd when you think about it. I mean, if you could stitch together human limbs, I mean, that's microsurgery. Why would you polish it off with a couple of rather bulky bolts through the neck? It's ridiculous, it's absurd, doesn't make sense. What does make sense is to see him presented with very, very deep-set, staring eyes. That's something that I can get behind, because again it falls within the usual conventions of the Gothic ideal. We expect a pair of deep-set, staring eyes, and you find them in every single Gothic horror story that there is. Probably most obvious in vampire stories like Dracula. But the idea that Frankenstein's creation is hunting him down and lurking in the darkness outside his room, waiting to come and murder his wife on their wedding night, that's a very Gothic idea. The idea that as a flash of lightning illuminates the sky, Victor can see this menacing figure lurking outside his window. Those kinds of images are perfect examples of what's made the Gothic horror genre so popular. So I definitely would envision him having very piercing eyes. That's pretty important, I think. So basically, if you think of Frankenstein's creation as being a monster, you should think about it in terms of a psychological monster rather than a physically unsightly monster.